The first time Marin Castillo saw the old woman, she was standing alone in the heart of a snowstorm, a paper bag split open at her feet, spools of red yarn tumbling down the frozen steps like warm streaks of blood on a silent white canvas. People walked around her. Some stepped over the yarn without so much as a glance. One man even trod on a spool and strode on, as though the old woman were merely a piece of the weather, something one was permitted to ignore. Marin stood behind the glass doors of the Halloran Tower lobby, her calloused hand still gripping a wet floor mop, and felt something tight. The first time Marin Castillo saw the old woman, she was standing alone in the heart of a snowstorm, a paper bag split open at her feet, spools of red yarn tumbling down the frozen steps like warm streaks of blood on a silent white canvas. People walked around her. Some stepped over the yarn without so much as a glance. One man even trod on a spool and strode on, as though the old woman were merely a piece of the weather, something one was permitted to ignore. Marin stood behind the glass doors of the Halloran Tower lobby, her calloused hand still gripping a wet floor mop, and felt something tighten in her chest. The old woman was dressed far too finely to be abandoned like that. An ash-gray wool coat, a scarf pinned with a small silver brooch, a pair of thin leather gloves worn soft with age. Yet she was small, trembling, swallowing her tears back down inside, in the middle of a hurrying crowd where no one would stop. At 27, Marin had learned that there are people in this world who become invisible not because they are faint, but because others have chosen not to see them. She understood that better than anyone. Every night, she scrubbed the gleaming corridors of a building where not a single soul could remember her name, and perhaps that was exactly why she could not walk away. Marin propped the mop against the wall, ignoring the manager barking her name from behind her, pushed open the heavy door, and stepped straight out into the biting snow. "Ma'am, please, hold still. Let me help you." She was already kneeling to gather the spools before the old woman could find her voice. The woman looked down at her, her eyes going still not from surprise at the kindness, but because it had been so very long since anyone had offered her any. What Marin did not yet know was that the trembling woman in the snow was no ordinary stranger, and the kindness she had just given away in a moment that seemed to cost nothing at all would, in less than a single day, lay the entire world of one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the city down upon the doorstep of her life. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so you can stay with us for the even more moving stories that lie ahead. Snow was still falling thickly when two men in black coats separated from the luxury car, parked close to the curb, and walked over. They moved quickly, but not hastily, with the careful restraint of men used to studying every corner before stepping into an open space. One of them bent down and lifted the old woman by the elbow with a gesture that was almost tender, while the other stood between her and the passing crowd, his eyes sweeping over Marin from head to toe. It wasn't the look of a curious man, but of someone committing her to memory. Marin felt a prickle crawl up her spine, but she didn't step back. She placed the last ball of yarn into the old woman's palm, gave her a faint smile, and said she should go home and warm herself before she caught a cold. The old woman held on to her hand for one more beat, longer than an ordinary thank you required, her gray eyes searching for something in Marin's face. Then she only whispered that kindness like hers was now as rare as January sunlight. Marin hadn't had time to answer before the man in the black coat gently helped the old woman into the car. The door closed with almost no sound, and the vehicle slid into the blinding curtain of snow as though it had never stopped there at all. She stood still for several seconds on the sidewalk, her hair covered with melting snowflakes that turned to cold water and ran down inside her collar, before she suddenly remembered she was still on shift. When she pushed open the glass door and stepped back into the lobby, the building's warmth rushed over her, making her numb hands throb. And Garrett Voss was already standing there waiting, his arms folded across his chest, his face flushed with the kind of anger he had never needed a decent reason to show. He asked what she thought she was doing, abandoning a half-mopped floor to run out into the street and put on a charity act. Marin tried to explain that an elderly woman had fallen in the snow, that no one had stopped to help, and that she'd only been outside for less than 3 minutes. Garrett cut her off, lowering his voice into that register he always used to make other people feel small. He said this building didn't pay her to play a living saint, that the tenants on the upper floors paid enormous sums to walk into a spotless lobby, not to watch a cleaning woman leave her post and wander around outside. Marin tightened her grip on the mop handle until her knuckles went white. Long ago, she had learned how to swallow the words she wanted to say back down her throat, to swallow anger, to swallow humiliation, as though forcing down a bitter pill without water. Garrett took out his phone, tapped it a few times, then announced with satisfaction that he would deduct 45 minutes from her pay that night, as a lesson so she'd remember her place next time. 45 minutes, Marin calculated in her head, almost the price of a box of vapor medicine for Posey. She opened her mouth, wanting to say that it was too much, that she hadn't been late for a single shift in the past 2 years. But then she saw something in Garrett's eyes, a kind of eager waiting, almost hungry, as if he was hoping she'd argue so he could go further. She understood this game. If she spoke up, he would write her up, and the third write-up meant losing her job, so she closed her mouth, lowered her head, and only said softly that she understood. Garrett snorted, satisfied with his easy victory, then walked away toward the elevator, leaving her alone in the vast lobby paved with polished granite. Marin stood there, listening to the low hum of the heating system overhead and the slow beat of her own heart inside her chest. She looked down at her cracked hands, worn raw by cleaning chemicals, the same hands that had just lifted balls of yarn for a stranger, and she wondered whether kindness was a luxury people like her had no right to own. But then she thought of Posey's small face, and of something her mother had told her years ago, that kindness was the only thing poverty couldn't take away from a person, and something inside her straightened again. She dipped the mop into the bucket of water that had gone cold, wrung it hard, and returned to the unfinished stretch of floor. She didn't know that the old woman in the snow had remembered the name embroidered on the chest of her uniform. She didn't know that at that very moment, inside the luxury car gliding through the snow-covered streets of Seattle, a phone call was being made, and a name was being mentioned with a level of attention no one in her life had ever given her before. She only knew that the night was still long, the floor was still wide, and somewhere on the other side of the city, a child was waiting for her to come home. It was well past midnight when Marin stepped down from the last bus and walked another 4 blocks beneath the flickering streetlights toward the apartment she shared with her daughter. The place she called home was really only an added-on room above a local auto repair shop, with a low ceiling, wooden floors that creaked under every step, and every time a car started up below in the morning, the whole room trembled faintly like a little boat on the water. But it was warm, and it was theirs, and to Marin, those 2 things were already more than she had ever dared to hope for. She slipped the key into the lock as gently as she could, opened the door quietly, hoping her daughter had fallen asleep. But the moment she stepped inside, she saw a small glow spilling from the moon-shaped nightlight, and Posey was sitting on the old rug, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair tousled, her wide eyes still awake and waiting. The little girl let out a soft cry of joy when she saw her mother, trying to hold her voice down because she knew it was late, then rushed over and wrapped her arms around Marin's legs, and Marin felt the whole long day dissolve inside that tiny embrace. She lifted her daughter into her arms, kissed her forehead, and asked why she was still awake at this hour. Posey whispered into her mother's ear that she couldn't sleep because she had a secret she wanted to show her. The little girl pulled her mother by the hand to the dining table, which was also her study table, where a sheet of paper had been placed neatly beneath the lamp. On it was a drawing done in crayon, the uneven lines of a 6-year-old child, but filled with joy, showing mother and daughter holding hands beneath a sky full of snowflakes shaped like stars. Posey pointed to the bigger figure and said, "That was Mommy, the most beautiful person in the world," then pointed to the smaller one and said, "That was her." And around the 2 of them, she had drawn a very big house with smoke rising from the chimney, because she wanted their home to be that warm someday. Marin felt her throat tighten, but she smiled as brightly as she could and said it was the most beautiful picture she had ever seen, more beautiful than all the paintings hanging in the elegant buildings where she worked. Then she fixed it to the refrigerator door with an apple-shaped magnet, right beside the other pictures her daughter had drawn through all those months and days. As she was tucking the blanket around her child, she heard Posey's breathing grow just a little heavier than usual. That very faint sound only a mother would notice, and she immediately reached for the nebulizer on the bedside shelf. The machine was very old now, its plastic casing yellowed with age, and its power cord wrapped with tape where it had frayed. But it still worked, and that was what mattered. She poured the medicine into the cup, gently fitted the small mask over her daughter's face, turned the machine on, and its soft, steady hum filled the quiet room like a lullaby. Posey was so used to it by now that she wasn't frightened at all. She only lay obediently in her mother's arms, her eyes half closed, while Marin quietly sang an old tune and stroked her hair, soothing her to breathe in and out slowly, evenly, until the little girl's breathing became light and gentle again. like wind slipping through a crack in the door. When Posey finally sank into deep sleep, her face peaceful and rosy once more, Maren sat silently beside her bed for a long while, watching her small chest rise and fall with steady breaths, and inside her mind the familiar numbers returned, aching in their sharpness. This month's rent, the medicine that was almost gone, and that old nebulizer that might not hold on much longer before she had to find a way to buy a new one with money she didn't yet know where to get. It was because of those numbers that she took the night shift, the shift no one wanted, the shift that left her back aching and dark circles under her eyes. Because the night shift paid a little more, and sometimes that little more was the thin line between her child having medicine and not having medicine. She bent down and kissed her daughter's cheek once more, pulled the blanket up to the little girl's chin, then whispered into the darkness that no matter how many shifts she had to work, Mommy would always be here, and she would never have to go without anything. 2 nights later, after Posey had fallen safely asleep under the watch of Mrs. Delphine, who lived in the same row of apartments, Maren put on her gray uniform again and returned to Halloran Tower, a place she had come to know by heart after more than 2 years of work, down to every centimeter, as intimately as the veins on the back of her own hand. She knew that building in a way no polished tenant on the upper floors ever could, because they only passed through it during the day in expensive suits, paused inside brightly lit rooms, then left again, while she belonged to it at night, when the entire tower sank into the kind of silence only people who worked the late shift had ever truly heard. She knew that elevator number 3 always hesitated for half a second on the 14th floor before continuing. She knew the emergency exit door on the 9th floor had a hinge that squeaked if it wasn't pushed the right way. She knew the hallway on the 21st floor was always colder than the others, because the heating system there had broken the winter before, and no one had bothered to fix it. The keycard clipped to her waist allowed her into almost every floor, every corridor, every room that needed cleaning, and she moved among them quietly like a shadow, pushing her cart of supplies through passageways that were crowded with people by day and so empty by night that the sound of its wheels rolling over the stone floor echoed down an entire long hallway. People often said that workers like her were invisible, and Maren had lived deeply enough inside that truth to understand that invisibility, sometimes, was also a strange kind of power. She could pass almost anywhere, stand beside almost anyone, clean right next to the most important conversations, and not a single person would truly notice her presence, as though she were part of the wall, a piece of the building itself. That night, while she was wiping the glass along the 18th floor corridor, she suddenly stopped because of a vague feeling she couldn't name, the kind of feeling people sometimes get when they step into a room where something has just happened, a tension still lingering in the air even though there is nothing visible to prove it. She lifted her eyes and looked down the empty hallway, where a few office doors were still leaking dim light even though it was far too late, and she realized that lately something about this tower had been different. Strange men she had never seen before sometimes appeared on the higher floors at unusual hours. Meetings took place behind closed doors at midnight. New keycards had been issued to faces she was certain didn't belong to any employee of the companies renting offices here. Maren wasn't a curious woman, and she had lived long enough as a poor person to understand that sometimes the wisest thing was not to see what had nothing to do with you, to lower your head and work and go home, to keep your eyes busy with the floor instead of the secrets of powerful people. But tonight, standing in the cold corridor of the 18th floor with a damp cloth still in her hand, she couldn't shake the uneasy instinct that the splendid glamour of Halloran Tower was only a thin shell, and beneath that polished granite and those sky-high panes of glass was something she didn't understand, something moving quietly in the dark, something it would be better for her never to touch. She shook her head to push the thought away, telling herself she was only tired, that the imagination of a sleep-deprived woman often drew shapes out of nothing. Then she pushed her cart on toward the end of the hall, never knowing that only a few days later, her intimate knowledge of every corner of this building, and the very instinct she was trying so hard to dismiss, would become the fragile line between one person's life and death. The next morning, when the night shift had just ended and the sun had not yet managed to drive away the frost clinging to the glass panes, Maren was putting away her supplies in the storage corner down in the basement when she heard footsteps echoing through the lobby. They weren't the hurried footsteps of office workers arriving early, but slow, even, decisive steps, the kind of sound that made a person lift their head without meaning to. When she stepped out of the storage room, she saw 3 men in black suits standing in the middle of the lobby, and that vast granite-floored space suddenly seemed to shrink around them, because they carried a silent authority that didn't require a single word. The man in the center was the tallest of them, with neatly cut salt and pepper hair and the calm face of someone accustomed to making others wary. And when his gaze came to rest on her, Marin recognized him at once as one of the two men who had helped the old woman into the car on that snowy night. Garrett appeared from somewhere and hurried over with a flattering smile. He had never once offered to anyone beneath his own position, asking what the gentleman needed and whether there was anything he could do to help. But the gray-haired man didn't even bother looking at him. He only turned straight toward Marin and asked in a steady, low voice whether she was Marin Castillo. Marin nodded, her heart beginning to beat faster, and she answered that yes, she was, though she didn't understand what she had done wrong. The man gave a slight shake of his head and said she had done nothing wrong at all. Then he reached inside his coat, and for one tense moment Marin held her breath, but what he drew out was only a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with red wax bearing the impression of a crest she didn't recognize. On the front of the envelope, her name had been written in elegant, slanting handwriting, the kind of script that belonged to an older generation, and he handed it to her with both hands, with a formality that left her confused. Marin opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten card, its words brief but warm, saying that on that freezing night in the snow, when the whole world turned away, she had stopped, that such a small act, in such a cold world, was something the writer would never forget, and that she earnestly hoped to see Marin again, so she could thank her properly. It was signed Wendeline Calloway. Marin lifted her head, about to say that the old woman was far too gracious, that she had only done what anyone should have done, but then she stopped when she heard that very surname come from Garrett's mouth. His face had gone pale. He stammered and asked whether it was Calloway, that Calloway family, and the gray-haired man merely glanced at him once, a single glance enough to silence Garrett as though someone had clamped a hand around his throat. Marin didn't understand what was happening, but she saw that the entire lobby had suddenly fallen deathly still. A few employees who had arrived early stood frozen in place, and even the air itself seemed to drop several degrees colder. An older co-worker standing nearby leaned close to her ear and whispered in a voice filled with both fear and reverence that the Calloway name in this city wasn't a name people mentioned casually, that the old woman Marin had helped in the snow was the mother of Royce Calloway, the man behind half of Seattle's largest financial deals, the man banks had to respect, politicians had to tread carefully around, and the man whose foolish enemies had a habit of disappearing without leaving a trace. Marin stood there, the envelope still trembling in her hand, and for the first time she understood that the moment she had knelt in the snow to gather those red balls of yarn, the moment she had thought wasn't worth a penny, had somehow opened a door into a world she had never dared step into, a world of power and darkness, and from this point on, her life would never be the same again. The gray-haired man, whom Marin would later learn was named Tobias, politely invited her to go with them that very morning, saying that Mrs. Wendeline very much hoped to see her and that the car was already waiting. And though 100 worries rose inside Marin, she couldn't find a reason solid enough to refuse an elderly woman who had written to her so sincerely. The car did not take her to a mansion as she had imagined, but back to Halloran Tower itself. Only this time, she was led to a private elevator. Her key card had never been able to open, an elevator with only one button, and it carried her straight to the highest floor, a place where she had never set foot in all her 2 years of work. When the elevator doors slid open, Marin stepped into a vast space flooded with light, where glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling and gave her a full view of snowy Seattle spread out below like a living map. Only then did she suddenly realize that she was standing in the very place people looked up at from the street and saw only as one tiny square of light at the top of the tower. In that room, several men in suits stood around a long table, speaking to one another in low voices. But when she entered, they all looked up, and seated at the far end of the room, behind a large dark wood desk, was a man she had never met, yet immediately knew had to be him. Royce Calloway was younger than she had expected, perhaps only in his early 30s, but there was something in the way he sat, in the way he rested his hands on the desktop, in his dark and still eyes, that made the whole room seem to revolve around his presence, like planets around a cold sun. He lifted his head slightly, and with only the faintest tilt of his chin, nearly too subtle to notice, all the other men in the room instantly bowed their heads and left in silence, not one of them daring to say a word. The door closed behind them, leaving Marin alone with the most powerful man she had ever stood near. He invited her to sit in a low, even voice, then thanked her for helping his mother on that snowy night, saying that she had told him everything, and that in a city where everyone hurried past one another, the fact that Marin had stopped was something that had made him pay attention. Marin answered that she had only done what her conscience told her to do, that any decent person would have done the same, and Royce looked at her for a long while, with the rare curiosity of a man unaccustomed to answers he had not anticipated. Then he opened a drawer, took out a thick envelope, slid it toward her across the glossy desk, and said with casual calm, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, that this was a small token of his family's gratitude, that he knew life was not easy for people like her, and that the money would make things a little less difficult. Marin looked down at the envelope, and for one instant she thought of Posey's medicine that was almost gone, of the old nebulizer, of this month's rent, of all the numbers that weighed on her shoulders every night. But then she pushed the envelope back toward him and said she hadn't come there to take money. Royce frowned slightly, and she realized that perhaps it had been a very long time since anyone had dared to return something he offered. He asked whether she knew how much money was inside, and Marin replied that she didn't need to know, because kindness that could be exchanged for money was no longer kindness, and she had helped his mother not because she was a poor woman in need of charity, but because his mother was a human being who needed help. The room sank into a strange silence. Royce leaned back in his chair, studying the small woman in the faded cleaning uniform, sitting upright before him with an expression she couldn't read. And for the first time in many years, the man the entire city feared realized that he was sitting across from someone who was not afraid of him at all. Nearly a week after that meeting, on an afternoon when Marin took Posey to the pediatric clinic for a routine visit to get more medicine, the cashier behind the counter looked at the computer screen, then smiled and told her something that made Marin think she must have heard wrong. The entire cost of the little girl's examination and medicine this time had already been paid in full. Not only that, but the outstanding medical debt from previous visits, the debt Marin had still been paying off little by little, had been completely cleared as well. Marin froze beside the counter, asking again and again whether there had been some kind of mistake, asking who had done it, and the employee only shook her head and replied that the person had asked to remain anonymous, leaving only a message that they hoped the child would soon be healthy, and that from now on, Marin's family could come to the clinic without worrying about the cost. In that moment, Marin should have felt relieved. She should have felt grateful, but instead, a cold feeling rose inside her, because she had lived long enough to know that in this world, very few gifts came without a price, and there was only one person in the world who knew about Posey's illness. One person to whom, during that tense conversation, she had accidentally mentioned her little daughter who needed medicine. She took Posey home, left her with Mrs. Delphine, then caught the bus back to Halloran Tower with a slow, burning anger smoldering in her chest. And this time, when she asked to see Royce Calloway, no one stopped her anymore. They simply escorted her straight to the highest floor, as though they had already been told she would come. Royce was standing beside the glass wall, looking out over the city when she walked in, and before he could fully turn around, Marin spoke, her voice trembling from the effort to hold herself together. She asked him what he thought he was doing, said she had made it very clear that she didn't need his money, and yet he had still secretly paid her daughter's medical bills, as though he could buy her loyalty that way. Royce turned and looked at her, his face still calm, and answered that he wasn't trying to buy anything. He said he had only done what he was capable of doing for a sick child, and that if she considered it an insult, he was sorry, but he wouldn't apologize for helping a little girl receive treatment. Marin opened her mouth, ready to pour out all the bitter words she had prepared during the entire ride there. Words about pride, about how she wasn't a beggar, about how she could take care of her own child. But then, suddenly, she thought of Posey's face that morning as the little girl came out of the examination room. The first time she had been carefully checked by a truly good doctor. The first time she had been prescribed the better medicine Marin had never dared to dream of because it was too expensive. The first time in all 6 years of her daughter's brief life that Marin hadn't had to stand at the pharmacy counter calculating whether she should buy the cheaper kind or leave something else behind so she could afford it. And just like that, without warning, the anger inside her broke into something else. Her throat tightened bitterly, her eyes burned, and she had to turn her face away so he wouldn't see the tears spilling out. Tears she couldn't stop, the tears of a mother who had grown too exhausted from holding herself up alone for far too long. Through her tears, she whispered that he couldn't understand, that she had become so used to managing everything by herself, that she no longer knew what to do when someone reached out to help. that the hardest thing for a person like her wasn't enduring hardship, but accepting kindness without feeling as though she were losing the last small piece of dignity she still had left. Royce stood silently watching her, and across the usually cold face of that man, something very faint passed, almost a softening, because for the first time he realized that the woman before him was strong not because she didn't know pain, but because she had been forced to carry too much of it alone. Perhaps during that tearful conversation, Marin had accidentally revealed more than she realized, because when she spoke about the nights she worked the late shift, about having her pay docked without reason, about the way a person could be strangled by nothing more than the petty power of a time card, Royce had listened in silence with a focused stillness she didn't know how to read. She hadn't named Garrett, she hadn't given details, but she had forgotten that she was speaking to a man whose life's work was reading the things other people left unsaid, and that for someone like Royce Calloway, finding the name of the man who had tormented her was only the work of an afternoon. A few days later, when Marin arrived at Halloran Tower to begin her shift as usual, she immediately sensed a strange atmosphere hanging over the employee area. Her co-workers were gathered in little groups, whispering to one another in voices filled with both astonishment and satisfaction. And when she stepped into the changing room, an older woman caught her by the arm, her eyes bright, and asked whether Marin had heard the news. Before Marin could ask what news, the woman told her that Garrett Voss, the manager who had tormented all of them for years, had been removed that morning. He hadn't been transferred. He hadn't been warned. He had been fired completely, and immediately, escorted out of the building in front of everyone. And not only that, people had discovered that for years he had been quietly skimming wages from employees, falsifying work hours, embezzling small amounts he thought no one would ever notice, and somehow all of that evidence had been gathered in full, down to the last detail, and placed on the board's desk overnight. Marin stood there listening, and she began to understand, a realization that sent a faint shiver down her spine, because she knew exactly where that evidence had come from. She knew who had enough power to make an entire man collapse in silence, with nothing more than a phone call, without a single threat, and without one act of violence. She heard that Garrett had begged that morning, had tried calling the connections he had always bragged about, but not one of them answered anymore, as though overnight the name Garrett Voss had become something no one in the city wanted to be associated with. He left Halloran Tower with the bloodless face of a man who had just realized he had accidentally stepped on the shadow of a force he hadn't even known existed. Marin returned to her work with a feeling so tangled she could hardly name it. Part of her felt relieved, even quietly satisfied when she thought of all the times he had humiliated her and her co-workers, but another part of her went cold when she realized how ruthless that man could be toward those he believed deserved punishment, how the quiet smoothness of the way he struck was more frightening than any loud burst of anger. But that evening, when she received a brief message from an unknown number with only a few words, saying that from now on no one would make things difficult for her at work anymore, Marin suddenly realized something she had not felt in a very long time. It was the feeling of having someone on her side, someone willing to use everything he had to protect her. And though the way he showed it was so cold and so clumsy that it left her both frightened and confused, deep in her heart, for the first time after so many years of carrying everything alone, she felt that she was no longer completely alone in this vast and freezing world. The weeks that followed passed in a rhythm Marin herself had never expected, because Mrs. Wendeline began stopping by the tower often in the afternoons, sitting in a corner of the lobby with a cup of hot tea, and inviting Marin to talk whenever she had a little free time, and through her, Marin was gradually drawn closer to the world she had once thought she would never touch. Royce appeared more often too, sometimes only by chance as he passed through, sometimes deliberately lingering a little longer, and although he always kept a certain distance, the caution of a man used to letting no one come too close, Marin could still sense that he was slowly allowing her to see the parts of himself he kept hidden behind that cold shell. Late one evening, when the whole tower had grown empty, and Marin was cleaning up in the waiting area on one of the higher floors, Royce stepped out of his office with 2 cups of coffee in his hands, and quietly set one down beside the place where she was resting, then sat in the chair across from her, without saying anything for a long while. It was in that silence, with the city lights flickering far away beyond the glass, and the whole space holding only the 2 of them, Royce finally spoke softly, asking whether she knew why he was so unyielding when it came to protecting the people he loved. And without waiting for her to answer, he continued in a low, strangely hoarse voice, saying that when he was 9 years old, his father had died suddenly in an incident he never described in detail, leaving his mother alone to fight against an entire world waiting to devour the weak. He said he had watched his mother struggle through the darkest years, had seen people take advantage of and trample a lonely woman, and from the time he was still a boy, he had promised himself that he would never again let anyone he loved be weak and unprotected. He said that was why he had built everything he had, why he had become the kind of man the whole city had to fear, because to him, power had never been the goal. It was only a fortress, a weapon, something that kept anyone from taking anything else away from him ever again. Marin listened in silence, and she realized that behind that powerful and frightening man was a 9-year-old boy still trembling inside the fear of loss, a boy who had learned to control everything around him only because he had once been helpless to watch the most important thing slip from his hands. She told him softly that she understood that feeling better than he thought, that she, too, had once watched someone she loved suffer while she could do nothing, and that such fear could turn a person into many different shapes. But she also gently added that sometimes loving someone didn't mean building a wall around them, but trusting them enough to let them stand on their own in their own way. Royce looked at her for a long time after those words, his eyes no longer holding their usual distance, but something softer instead, almost wounded, and in that moment, two people from two worlds separated by an entire abyss suddenly realized that they carried the same old wound inside them. Only each had chosen a different way to live with it. They sat together for a long while longer in the late-night light, not saying much more, only quietly drinking the 2 cups of coffee that had gone cold. But that silence was not awkward at all. It was warm in a strangely tender way. And when Marin went home that night, she knew that something between her and that man had quietly changed, that some door had softly opened, though neither of them yet dared to name it. That afternoon began like any other afternoon. Mrs. Wendeline arrived at the tower earlier than usual, carrying a box of homemade butter cookies that she kept insisting Marin had to taste, and the two women sat side by side in their familiar corner of the lobby, laughing and talking about all the small, ordinary things in life as though they had known each other for many years, not only a few short weeks. Marin noticed that the old woman looked paler than usual that day, and more than once, she stopped in the middle of a sentence to draw in a deep breath, as though the air in the lobby had suddenly grown thin. But when Marin asked with gentle concern, "Mrs. Wendeline," only waved her hand and laughed it off, saying that this old body of hers acted up now and then, and that Marin shouldn't make such a fuss, just like her overly worried son. Yet only a few minutes later, in the middle of their conversation, Marin suddenly saw the teacup in Mrs. Wendeline's hand tremble. Then the old woman's face tightened with pain. Her hand rose to clutch her chest, and before Marin could understand what was happening, that small, fragile woman had gone limp, tipping sideways out of her chair, with a reflex that even Marin herself would never later be able to explain. She rushed forward and caught her before she hit the stone floor, her arms wrapping around the frail body that had gone frighteningly soft. She gently lowered Mrs. Wendeline onto the floor, calling her name again and again, her voice ringing through the great lobby with both urgency and a desperate effort to remain calm. Years of struggling to survive had taught Marin a few things about managing in moments of crisis. She immediately loosened the scarf around the old woman's neck, lifted her head slightly, pressed her ear close to her chest to listen for breath, then turned and shouted toward the reception desk for them to call an ambulance right away, and the lobby, which was usually so solemn and dignified, suddenly burst into confusion. She held tightly to Mrs. Wendeline's cold hand, patting it softly, while whispering that she had to hold on, that Marin was right here, that everything was going to be all right. The old woman's eyes, though clouded and fading in and out, still tried to search for Marin's face, her lips moving as though she wanted to say something but could not make a sound. And then, so quickly that it stunned Marin, the private elevator doors sprang open, and Royce rushed out. There was nothing left in him of the calm, cold man the whole city feared. His hair was disheveled, his tie loosened, and he crossed the lobby in long, urgent strides before dropping to his knees beside his mother. Marin had never seen any face like Royce's face in that moment, because written across it was something that power, money, and ruthlessness could not hide. The naked, pure terror of a son standing on the edge of losing his mother, the fear of a man used to controlling everything, now helpless before the one thing no power in this world could ever command. He called his mother's name with a shaking voice, his hands, usually so steady, now awkward and uncertain, as if he no longer knew what to do with them. Marin had to take him by the shoulder and tell him in a firm voice that she was still breathing, that the ambulance was on its way, that he needed to stay calm, because right now his mother needed him to be strong. In that chaotic moment, between the distant wail of sirens and the hurried footsteps of the paramedics rushing in, Royce lifted his eyes to Marin, and their gazes met. It was a look that needed no words, a look in which the most powerful man in the city allowed someone else, for the first time, to see just how fragile and helpless he truly was. The hospital corridor late at night carried a silence all its own, the silence of places where people both hoped and feared, where every nurse's footsteps passing by made those who sat waiting jerk their heads up with anxious eyes. Marin sat beside Royce on two hard plastic chairs outside the emergency room, and the man who had once made the whole city hold its breath now sat bent forward, his elbows braced on his knees, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had gone white, his eyes fixed on the closed door behind which the doctors were fighting for his mother's life. She didn't know what to say to comfort him, because she understood that in moments like this, every empty word of consolation became meaningless. So she simply sat there quietly with him, sharing that heavy waiting in the only way she knew how, by not letting him face it alone. After a long stretch of silence, it was Marin who finally spoke softly, her voice gentle, as though she were afraid of breaking the fragile air around them. She told him she knew exactly what he was enduring in that moment. The feeling of sitting outside a door and knowing that the fate of the person you loved most was being decided on the other side, while you could do nothing at all. Royce lifted his head and looked at her, and Marin drew in a deep breath, then told him something she had never told anyone at work, that many years before, when she was still very young, her mother had fallen ill with a sickness that medicine could have treated if it had been handled properly and in time. But they had been too poor. So poor that every time they went to the hospital, Marin had to stand at the cashier's desk calculating how much she could pay, had to choose between one medicine and another, had to put off the tests the doctor ordered simply because there wasn't enough money. She told him she had watched her mother grow weaker day by day, had seen the woman who had once been strong and full of life wither away on a hospital bed. And the most terrible part had not been the final departure, but the knowledge that, if they had only had money, if they had only had enough money, everything could have been different. Marin's voice trembled as she went on, saying that was why, when he paid Posey's medical bills, she had been so angry, and yet so broken, because her entire life had been haunted by the fear that one day she would have to stand at that cashier's desk again, have to choose again, have to helplessly watch someone she loved slip away because of numbers. And this time, that person would be her daughter. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed that the greatest fear of a poor mother wasn't hunger or cold, but the feeling that her love for her child was infinite, while her power to protect that child was painfully limited. Royce listened to every word, and Marin saw something shift in his eyes, a depth of understanding so profound it didn't need to be spoken. Because he too had once been the child standing beside that sickbed, he too had tasted the bitterness of helplessness. And now, the vast distance between the penthouse and the polished hallways below seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by a profound connection that required no status or wealth to understand. Royce slowly reached out, and for the first time, he was the one who took her trembling hand, not with the grip of a powerful man trying to bestow something, but with the touch of one human being seeking shelter in another. He told her softly that she was no longer alone in that fear, that from now on, she would never have to stand alone at any cashier's desk again. Just then, the emergency room door opened, and both of them sprang to their feet, their hearts pounding, as the doctor told them that Mrs. Wendelin had passed through the danger and was gradually stabilizing again. About 2 weeks after Mrs. Wendelin was discharged from the hospital and began slowly recovering. Marin's life seemed to be turning toward a gentler new chapter, but she had no idea that the vague, uneasy instinct she had once tried to push aside during those earlier night shifts was about to come true in the most terrifying way. That night, Marin was assigned to clean the meeting room area on the 23rd floor, one of the highest floors in the tower, which at an hour this late was usually completely silent and empty, without a single soul in sight. She was pushing her cart along the dim corridor when she suddenly heard voices drifting out from a conference room that should have been closed and dark by then. By the instinct of her work, an instinct so deeply rooted in her bones that it had taught her the safest thing was not to interfere in anything that had nothing to do with her, Marin meant to quietly turn her cart around and leave for another area. But then a name slipped into her ear and made her freeze in the middle of the hallway. It was the name Calloway, spoken with a tone full of hatred and calculation. Her heart began to pound, and although reason told her she had to leave immediately, her feet seemed nailed to the floor. She pressed herself into the darkness behind a large column near the half-open conference room door, and through the narrow gap, she saw several men seated around a long table, the desk lamp throwing light across faces she did not recognize, except for one. The man she recognized was one of Royce's trusted associates, a man she had once seen standing beside him in the room on the highest floor, a man Royce trusted completely. Yet now he was sitting there, bowing his head and whispering with strangers, and through the words that reached her in broken pieces, Marin slowly pieced together a truth that made her blood turn cold. Those strangers were men from the Sorrento family, a force she had only heard about faintly through the whispers of coworkers, a name spoken of as an enemy of the Calloway family. And the treacherous associate was selling out his own master, feeding them information about Royce's schedule, about weaknesses in his security system, about even the people closest to him whom he would never suspect, all in exchange for money and a position in the new order the Sorrento family was plotting to build after they removed Royce. Marin stood frozen in the dark, her breathing turning shallow and quick, and she knew she had accidentally heard something that an invisible cleaning woman like her was never meant to hear, a deadly secret, one that simply knowing was enough to turn her into a danger that needed to be erased. She tried to step backward as quietly as possible, one step at a time, both hands still gripping the handle of her cart so it wouldn't make a sound. But in that moment of unbearable tension, one of the cart's wheels rolled over the edge of a rug and gave a soft creak, a tiny sound that, in the deadly stillness of the late-night corridor, rang out as clearly as an alarm bell. The voices inside the conference room stopped at once, and Marin heard chairs scraping, hurried footsteps moving toward the door, and in an instant, she understood that she had to run. She abandoned the cart and raced down the corridor toward the emergency stairwell she knew by heart, her heart hammering inside her chest. But just as she managed to disappear around the corner, a cold voice sounded behind her, ordering someone to find whoever had been standing outside that door, because no one who had heard what had just been said could be allowed to leave this building alive. Marin escaped from the tower that night by slipping through the emergency exits that only she knew by heart. But she knew she was no longer safe, and in the days that followed, that fear grew into a pitch-black shadow covering every moment of her life. She began noticing unusual signs. A strange car parked on the corner across from the apartment above the auto repair shop for longer than normal, a man she had never seen before leaning against the bus stop where she waited every evening, a feeling of being watched that clung stubbornly to the back of her neck every time she stepped outside. And though she tried to reassure herself that perhaps she was only panicking too much, deep in her heart she knew the Sorrento family had found her. But the blow that nearly made her collapse was not the shadows lurking around her. It came one morning, when she tried to warn Royce about the betrayal she had witnessed, and his people came to take her to a safe place. It was there, on the table in front of her, that she saw a file Royce's people had gathered from the other side. A file showing just how thoroughly the Sorrento family had investigated her. Marin's hands trembled as she turned each page, because inside were not only details about her, where she lived, and her work schedule, but also a photograph of the elementary school Posey attended, along with the exact address and even the dismissal time, carefully noted in cold, emotionless handwriting. In the moment she saw the name of her daughter's school lying there in the file of people willing to do anything to silence a witness, Marin felt as though the whole world beneath her feet had given way. Blood rushed to her temples, and a terror unlike anything she had ever known in her life seized her heart, because the danger was no longer hers alone. It had touched the most sacred and fragile thing in her entire life, her innocent little girl. She sprang to her feet, the file falling from her hand, and she was almost choking as she said she had to get to her daughter immediately, that she had to make sure the little girl was safe, her voice breaking with the panic of a mother who had just realized the dark shadow she was running from had reached the threshold of the most precious thing in her world. Royce, who was there, immediately stepped forward and took hold of her shoulders, and in a voice both firm and desperately calming, he told her that he had already sent people to protect Posey early that morning, that the little girl was still completely safe, that no one would be able to touch a single hair on her head while his people were stationed inside and out. He gave orders right in front of Marin, moving more men into place, tightening the circle of protection around the school and around the apartment she shared with her daughter, and Marin saw in his eyes a fierce hardness, the silent promise of a man who would never allow the tragedy he had lived through as a child to repeat itself with the people he now considered his own. But even standing within that solid ring of protection, even hearing those unshakable assurances, Marin still couldn't put out the flame of fear burning through her heart, because she understood something that perhaps even Royce, with all his power, could never fully understand. Once a mother's heart has felt a threat closing in around her child, it can never truly be at peace again. And it was in that long, sleepless night that a frightening thought began to kindle inside her mind, a thought she knew would change everything. The thought that had begun to kindle during that long, sleepless night grew larger and larger until it filled Marin's entire mind. And after many hours of sitting alone in the dark, watching her daughter sleep, she came to a decision she knew would break her own heart. But it was the only decision a mother like her could make. She believed that as long as she remained in this city, as long as she stayed tied to Royce and to the dangerous world surrounding him, Posey's school would remain written inside those cold files, and no circle of protection, no matter how strong, could ever truly give her peace, because she had seen with her own eyes just how close people could reach toward her child. In the desperate logic of a mother who had become too frightened, Marin believed that if she disappeared, if she took her daughter far away from this place, away from Royce, away from the Sorrento family, away from everything, then perhaps the little girl would be safe. Perhaps those dark shadows would no longer have any reason to chase after a nameless cleaning woman who had left the life of a powerful boss behind. And so, quietly, she began to make arrangements, packing the few things she and her daughter could carry into an old suitcase, withdrawing the last savings she had scraped together and hidden in a tin box, and buying 2 long-distance bus tickets to a small city in another state, where she had a distant aunt she hoped might let the 2 of them stay for a while. On the night before they were to leave, she sat beside Posey's bed for a long time, watching her sleep, stroking her soft hair, and whispering to the sleeping child that Mommy was sorry for having to take her somewhere strange again, that Mommy knew she would miss her school and her friends, but that Mommy was doing all of this only because she loved her more than her own life, and that as long as Posey was safe, she could endure anything. But there was one thing she couldn't leave without doing, and that was seeing Royce one last time. When she came to him to say goodbye, that man recognized at once what she was about to do, because he was far too used to reading the things other people tried to hide. He asked whether she intended to leave, and when Marin nodded through her tears, something in his eyes shattered. He told her she didn't have to do that he could protect her and Posey, that he had enough power and enough people to make sure no one could hurt either of them. But Marin only shook her head, tears running down her face, and told him in a choked voice that this was exactly the problem, that she couldn't raise her daughter in a world where every time the little girl stepped outside, Marin had to hold her breath in fear, that she couldn't let Posey become a pawn, a weakness, a name inside the files of people willing to hurt a child to get what they wanted. She told him that she knew he would do everything to protect them, but the very fact that she needed that much protection was proof that this place was not meant for her daughter, and that sometimes loving someone meant having the courage to walk out of their life for something better. Royce stood there, the most powerful man in the city, a man who could make all of Seattle tremble with a single phone call, and yet now he was helpless to keep the woman standing before him, because he understood that what was making her leave was not the absence of feeling, but the depth of a mother's love, the kind of love even he had to bow his head before in respect. And so he let her go, standing silently as he watched her small figure disappear behind the door, unaware that fate would not allow these 2 people to part so quietly. The long-distance bus for mother and daughter was scheduled to depart early the next morning, but before leaving, Marin still had one final thing to do, and that was to stop by Halloran Tower to return her keycard and uniform, because even if she had to run away, her pride would not allow her to disappear like a thief. She had left Posey in the care of trustworthy Mrs. Delphine for a few hours, carefully telling her that she would come back for her daughter as soon as everything was done. When she stepped into the tower in that dim hour before dawn, when the building was almost entirely silent, the instinct sharpened through 2 years of working in darkness immediately began ringing warnings inside her, because too many things were out of place. The emergency exit on the ground floor, which should always have been locked tight at this hour, was slightly ajar. A man in a maintenance uniform was bent over near the elevator control panel, but Marin had never seen him before, and she knew the face of every maintenance worker on this shift. And when she glanced at the floor indicator above the elevator doors, she saw that the private elevator, the one that normally stopped only at the highest floor, was now paused on a mechanical floor it should never have gone to. Each small detail, the sort of thing any outsider would have passed over without the slightest suspicion, fitted itself together inside Marin's mind into a picture that made her heart seem to stop, because she suddenly understood that the Sorrento family had chosen tonight to strike, that they had used the very information the traitorous associate had leaked to break into the tower, disable the security system, and that Royce was somewhere above her, perhaps alone, completely unaware that death was quietly climbing floor by floor to find him. In that moment, Marin stood before a choice that tore her apart, because her feet were pointed toward the door, toward Posey waiting for her, toward the bus that would carry mother and daughter to a new life of safety and peace. And reason screamed inside her head that this was not her problem, that she had already decided to leave, that she had a child who needed her alive to care for her. But then she thought of Royce, of his face stripped bare by fear that night at the hospital, of his trembling hand holding hers, of the man who had silently erased the greatest fear of her life without demanding anything in return. And she understood that if she left now, if she walked through that door and abandoned him to the death waiting in the shadows, she would never be able to live in peace with herself, that she would become the very kind of person who had once walked past Mrs. Wendelin in the snow without stopping. And so, against everything reason told her, Marin turned and ran toward the stairwell instead of the exit, because she knew the elevators were no longer safe, and she began to run, climbing one step after another with frantic force, her chest burning, her legs shaking, racing through dark corridors she knew by heart as well as her own breathing, slipping through shortcuts known only to people who did quiet, unseen work like hers. She avoided two strange men guarding the main elevator area by ducking through a side corridor leading into the mechanical section. She held her breath and pressed herself behind the pipes when she heard their footsteps echo close by. And every passing second felt as heavy as an entire century, because she knew she was racing against time, that every moment of delay could become the moment that decided between life and death for the man she had not had time to admit she loved. When she finally reached the highest floor, her lungs feeling as though they might burst, Marin shoved open the door to the waiting area and rushed inside, just in time to see Royce's familiar figure stepping out of his office. And behind him, from the darkness of the opposite corridor, a shadowy figure was silently moving closer with the measured steps of a predator. With no time left to think for even one more second, Marin gathered every last breath remaining in her chest and screamed his name so loudly that it echoed across the entire top floor. Marin's scream tore through the silence of the top floor, and in that life-or-death instant, Royce reacted with the speed and precision of a man who had spent his entire life living on the edge of danger. He turned and dodged to the side just as the attacker lunged from the darkness, and the strike that should have ended him missed by a breath. Marin didn't hesitate. With every instinct of someone who knew every hidden corner of this place by heart, she grabbed the cleaning staff cart sitting nearby and shoved it with all her strength straight into the attacker. The heavy cart slammed into him, making him stagger and lose his balance. And that precious interruption gave Royce enough time to reclaim control. The man who had always seemed so calm now became cold and dangerous as a blade. He moved through the chaos with a terrifying composure. Every motion was decisive and calculated. In that chaotic light, Marin truly saw the man the entire city feared not for his cruelty, but for his absolute control. Not through noisy brutality, but through a cold and unshakable authority, even when his own life was under threat. But the Sorrento family had not sent only one man. From another stairwell, more shadowed figures rushed in, and within moments, the vast waiting area on the highest floor became a maze of bodies chasing one another through flickering lights and reflected glass. Marin, with the advantage of knowing the layout better than any of those strangers, became the one piece they had never anticipated. She knew which doors led where, which pockets of darkness could hide a person, which passage would trap a pursuer, and she kept moving, pulling their attention away from Royce, knocking over large planters and decorative screens to block their path, turning the quiet knowledge of a cleaning woman into a weapon no gun could match. Just as Royce brought down the last attacker closing in on him, he suddenly saw another figure rushing toward Marin from behind, where she couldn't see him. Without even a second of hesitation, that powerful man did something he had never done for anyone in his life. He threw himself toward her, pushed her out of danger, and used his own body to shield her, taking the full force of the blow meant for her. Marin felt his body jerk, heard a small, suppressed sound of pain break from his throat, and when she turned back, she saw him staggering against the wall, one hand pressed to his side, his face gone pale, yet his eyes still never leaving her, as though the only thing that mattered to him in that moment was that she was still whole. Just then, heavy footsteps thundered through the floor as Tobias rushed in with Royce's men, somehow alerted by Marin before she had raced up here. And in the blink of an eye, the tide turned completely. The remaining Sorrento attackers were swiftly subdued, and the traitorous associate was dragged out from his hiding place, with the bloodless face of a man who understood that his game was over. But Marin no longer had any mind for any of that. She dropped to her knees beside Royce, her trembling hands supporting him, tears streaming down her face as she called his name and begged him to hold on. And Royce, even in that pain, still gave her a faint, pale smile, whispering softly that it seemed she hadn't made it onto her bus after all, and that he had never been so grateful for a delay in his entire life. Royce's wound, fortunately, was not as life-threatening as Marin had feared during those horrifying moments, and after he was taken to the hospital and treated by the doctors, he was out of danger after only one night. But the most important thing about that fateful night was not the failure of the attack, but what happened afterward in the underworld that Marin only dimly understood. People said that the Sorrento family, after their plot had been completely broken, did not launch a revenge strike as rival forces normally would. Instead, they quietly pulled back, quietly sought peace, quietly accepted terms they never would have conceded before. And the reason for that unexpected retreat was not that they feared Royce's strength or power, because they had long known exactly how powerful he was. It was because, in that chaotic night, on the highest floor of Halloran Tower, those who witnessed it had seen something they had never seen in that cold and terrifying man. The moment he threw himself forward to shield a woman, the moment his face showed naked, fear not for his own life, but for her safety. In the world where people like the Sorrento family lived, a world where everything was measured by weaknesses and advantages, seeing a powerful man willing to trade his life for someone else was not a sign of weakness to be exploited. On the contrary, it was the most frightening warning of all, because they understood that a man who had something to lose and was willing to die for it was an enemy no one wanted to face, an enemy who would never retreat, never tremble, never stop until he had protected what he treasured. And so, by the strange and cold logic of that underworld, the war between the two families ended not in blood but in understanding. The Sorrento family realized that the price of continuing this war had become too high, and they chose to let go. But all those calculations of the underworld were far from Marin's mind, because in the days that followed, the only thing she cared about was sitting beside Royce's hospital bed, caring for the man who had risked himself for her. And it was in those quiet moments, as he lay there with his face still pale and she sat beside him, feeding him spoonful by spoonful of porridge, that she truly absorbed the meaning of what he had done. She realized that in that brief instant when he had thrown himself forward to shield her, he had not calculated anything, had not weighed loss against gain, had not thought of the empire he had worked so hard to build, or of all the things he could lose. He had simply acted according to the call of his heart. And for a man who had spent his entire life controlling everything, and never allowing himself to become weak, willingly placing himself in danger for another person, was the most sincere and powerful confession of love he could ever give. Marin sat there, holding his hand, and she understood that she could no longer run away, not because she was trapped, but because her heart had chosen to stay. And when Royce woke and found her eyes watching over him, he gently tightened his hand around hers, and both of them understood that between them there was no longer any need for words, because that night on the high floor of the tower had spoken for everything that two people, both so used to hiding their feelings, had never dared to say aloud. That winter slowly passed, and along with the last snowflakes melting on the streets of Seattle, Royce's wound healed as well. But there were other things inside him that had changed forever, and could never return to what they had once been. Marin did not board that long-distance bus that day, and she did not return to the invisible life of a cleaning woman in the tower as before, because her life had now turned down a path she herself had never dared to dream of. Yet what made her proudest was not that she had stepped into Royce's world, but that she had chosen to step into it in her own way. She refused to let Royce buy her a luxurious house, or provide her with a life of silk and comfort that she had not worked for. Instead, she told him that what she truly needed was not to be given everything, but to be given the chance to stand on her own. And so, with his quiet support, she returned to school to finish the degree she had once been forced to abandon years ago when her mother fell ill, building one step at a time, a path she could someday proudly tell her daughter about. One afternoon, when the warm spring sunlight poured into the small but tidy new apartment that Marin and Posey now called home, Royce came to visit, and instead of carrying a velvet box with a glittering diamond ring inside, as Marin had secretly feared, he only placed a simple little brass key in the palm of her hand. When she looked at him in confusion, silently asking what it meant, he softly explained that it was the key to her apartment, a copy she could keep or give back to him as she chose, because he said he did not want to enter her life and her daughter's life as a powerful man who assumed the right to possess them. He wanted to be allowed in by her. He wanted every time he knocked on her door to be because she opened her heart to welcome him, not because he had the right to walk in on his own. Marin looked at the small key in her hand, and she understood that the man who had once controlled an entire city had just given her not ownership, but choice. He had placed in her hand not a chain, but freedom, and that was the most meaningful gift someone like him could ever give. On the wall of the new apartment, right where the morning sunlight touched it each day, hung a small glass frame, and inside that frame was not an expensive painting or an award certificate, but a ball of red yarn that had faded slightly with the passing years. Whenever someone asked about it, Marin only smiled and did not explain much, because there are some things the heart understands better on its own than through any telling. Posey, now much healthier thanks to proper care, had gradually grown attached to Royce with the innocent ease of a child, and it was strange how the man who had once made the entire city fear him could become so awkward and gentle whenever the little girl tugged his hand and made him sit on the floor to color pictures with her, or when he patiently listened as she chattered about her day at school. In those warm moments, Marin would stand watching from the kitchen doorway with a tender smile, silently thanking that freezing, snowy night long ago for anchoring her heart to a future she no longer had to face alone. And if there is one lesson left behind by this story, it is that kindness, no matter how small, and no matter how worthless it may seem, can quietly plant seeds we never expect, that a person's dignity is not found in the amount of money they carry in their pocket, but in the way they treat others when no one is watching, and that true love is never possession or control, but giving the one you love the freedom and safety to stand firmly on their own 2 feet. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone you believe still needs to know that even